I will be 6 or 7 events from now, and I don't know what city I'm in, and actually don't care either, so hopefully that'll let us have a good, energized discussion. As Sonali said, it's been a little bit more than a year since I went to Hong Kong back in June of 2013 in order to meet the person who I think is clearly one of the most important, if not the single most important source in the history of American journalism, Edward Snowden. And in the year that has followed, at least for me, it has been a bit intense. But it hasn't only been intense for me personally, it's been really intense for a lot of other people as well. It's definitely been very intense for the very fine men and women at the National Security Agency. And it has also been very intense for the senior national security official in the Obama administration, James Clapper, who got caught red-handed lying to the American people through the United States Senate about what it was that the NSA is doing. Lying that is every bit as much of a felony as anything that Edward Snowden is accused of doing. Except, unlike Edward Snowden, who is facing many decades in prison and multiple felony charges and forced to live in Moscow in order not to live the rest of his life in a cage, James Clapper, like every single other national security and corporate elite of the last decade who has committed egregious crimes, has faced no legal accountability of any kind, but at least it's been an intense year for him as well, so we can console ourselves with that. It has definitely been an intense year for President Obama, who has had to navigate the fallout of having been exposed for presiding over an extremely aggressive expansion of the very surveillance system which he vowed repeatedly in 2007 and 2008 that he would fundamentally rein in. It has, as Sonali suggested, been a pretty intense year for lots of media outlets that have had to account for their behavior over the last decade or so. And it has, I think, first and foremost, above all else, been a very intense year of revelations for the numerous populations around the world in multiple countries on multiple continents who have learned for the first time that, contrary to what they've been led to believe for many, many years by the United States government, this sprawling, limitless system of surveillance is directed not at terrorist or other national security threats, but is instead directed indiscriminately at them. And one of the reasons why I think the intensity has been so sustained, the reason that I'm able to travel around not only the United States, but also Latin America, which is what I was doing for the last 2 weeks, and all of Europe, which I did for the 3 weeks prior to that, and have large auditoriums like this one filled with people who come and want to talk about these surveillance revelations. The reason that I think the intensity has been so sustained for so long is because the debate that was triggered by these revelations actually ended up being about a lot more than just surveillance. In fact, the debates have been about a wide array of other issues, at least as significant as, if not more significant than, the question of surveillance. There has been, for the first time globally, a very profound examination of what individual privacy means in the digital age and why it matters. There has been a serious debate about the dangers of vesting large governments with immense power that they can exercise in the dark with no transparency or real accountability. There has been a very serious debate about the role that the United States plays in the world generally and the enormous gap between the marketing and branding image sold to the world about Barack Obama and the reality of who he really is and what he does. And there has been a really important and I think long-lasting debate about the proper role of journalism, and especially the proper role of a journalist vis-a-vis those who wield the greatest power. And one of the reasons that I love coming to events like this, especially over the last 6 weeks, is that over the last year, as I was doing this reporting, I was very focused on specific revelations. What is this specific surveillance program, and what is it that this capability actually enables, and what is the technology that has been developed that allows the NSA to invade our communications in the ways that they're invading it. And a lot of that, I think, not just for me working on the story, but for those people who have been following it around the world, has somewhat obscured the broader implications of the story and the revelations in the aggregate, the reasons why I think they've resonated so much around the world and why I think they will continue to endure for a long time. And so being able to come to events like this gives me the first opportunity I've had in a year to sort of stop and take a deep breath and think about those things. And that is actually one of the reasons why I was so excited to write this book as well. Because the thing about writing a book is that it is actually an extremely miserable experience. I'm sure that anybody who's written a book will tell you the same thing. It is really soul-draining and grueling and really quite awful. And one of the things I've learned about book writing, this is the 5th book that I've written, is that the key to writing a book is you have to have some very compelling motive, some real passion behind writing the book. There has to be some reason why you've written it. And I think good books and bad books can almost, in every case, be determined by whether or not the person writing it is writing it just to write it, or write it because they have something really compelling that they want to achieve. And so, a lot of times what I like to do when talking about a book I've written and thinking about the issues that I tried to raise in it is talk about the motives that I had in writing it, what actually led me to want to write it. And one of the principal motives I had in writing this book, aside from being able to, for the first time, sit back and think about the broader implications besides just the individual stories, is that so much has been said over the last year in establishment American media circles about what Edward Snowden did, and about the reporting that we did, and about what these documents show, the vast majority of which is just wrong. It's just factually false. And if you are somebody who loves to bash the American media and talk about how awful American journalists are, and I am somebody definitely who loves to do that. That is one of my most favorite things to do. Then you will know, and it won't come as any surprise to you to learn, that all the time American media outlets, in a very authoritative tone, present all sorts of things as clear facts that are just completely wrong and false. But when you are at the center of a story that the American media is paying an enormous amount of attention to, your appreciation for just how willing and eager they are to disseminate falsehoods escalates substantially. It really has been a remarkable experience to watch the extent to which they're willing to do that, even given the extreme amount of scorn that I began the experience by harboring for them. And so I just want to talk about a few of the principal falsehoods that they have disseminated, not just because I want to talk about the reasons why they're false, but much more importantly, I want to talk about some of the things that I think the falsehoods reveal about our broader political discourse. So the first myth, the first falsehood that I want to talk about is one that I'm certain that you've heard many, many times. In fact, if you turn on any of the serious television shows on Sunday morning or the news broadcast programs that have talked about Edward Snowden and these revelations, you almost invariably hear it in almost every single conversation. And that is the notion that Edward Snowden is a Russian spy. This is something that you will invariably hear every single time you hear this talked about. And one of the things that shocked me the most when I went and wrote this book was what I did was I went back and I looked at what the discourse was in the United States in the immediate aftermath of our writing our first story. Because in June of 2013, when the whole story exploded, I was in Hong Kong, focused on the documents and working with my source. I was mercifully ignorant of the things that American pundits were saying. But I went back and I looked at what was being said about Edward Snowden in the story in June of 2013, and what was so amazing to me was that what was being said then, this was a time that he was in Hong Kong, this was before he ended up getting trapped in Moscow. What was being said then was, in the same authoritative tone, oh, it's very obvious. I mean, there's just no question. I mean, Edward Snowden is a Chinese spy. This is an operation being run out of Beijing. And when he ended up being trapped in Moscow, the very same people who were saying that, their accusations instantly morphed into, oh, of course he's a Russian spy, without any acknowledgement that they were saying something profoundly different just 2 weeks earlier. And I am positive that if Edward Snowden were somehow able to escape Moscow tomorrow and make his way to, I don't know, Lima. Let's pick that as an example. He just somehow ended up in Lima. The very same people who have been saying these things would say, oh, I mean, it was so obvious all along. I mean, he was a Peruvian spy. Because they will say anything that they can to demean him and malign him. And the best example that I can point you to, in fact, the one that is so amazing that it's actually hilarious, is this op-ed that appeared just 4 weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal by this person named Edward J. Epstein, who's just one of these people who like works in the underground sewers of Washington think tanks, and every now and then he pops up in big important op-ed pages to pontificate some sort of opinion. And in this op-ed, he talked about his views of the Snowden disclosures, and what he said was, you know what, I want to read this quote to you verbatim rather than summarize it, because it's really one of my favorite quotes ever. This is an op-ed from May 10th, 2014 in the Wall Street Journal by Edward J. Epstein, and what he says is, he talked to a senior Obama cabinet official who off the record told him, and this is a quote, there are only three possibilities for the Snowden heist. There are only three possibilities. One, it was a Russian espionage operation. Two, it was a Chinese espionage operation. Or three, it was a joint Sino-Russian operation. And what that is, translated into honest English, is we have absolutely no idea what happened here, but we are willing to say anything at all, no matter how evidence-free it is, if it's sufficient to malign his reputation. And the thing that I find really fascinating about this is not just that there's so much evidence that just instantly negates the accusation and renders it facially untrue. I mean, the fact that he was in Hong Kong and was forced to leave by the Chinese government, told that if he didn't leave, they would turn him over to the US government, is not exactly the kind of treatment typically extended by the Chinese government to Chinese spies. Or the fact that when he was in Moscow and landed there, he was forced to stay 5 weeks in the transit zone at the international airport while the Putin government negotiated with the US government over things the Russians could get in exchange for handing him over. Not really the typical treatment extended by Vladimir Putin to Russian spies. But the most compelling evidence for why it's so ridiculous is that he actually never chose to be in Moscow in the first place. He was trapped there. He was forced to be there by the United States. He was on his way attempting to transit through Russia on his way to Havana and then make his way to Ecuador, where he intended to seek asylum. When the US government, while he was on the plane from Hong Kong, just unilaterally revoked his passport. Did you even know the US government has that power? They can just wake up one day and say, no hearing, no charges, no due process. We hereby decree that your passport is from hence this point forward invalid. And you are then prevented, even if you're outside of your country, from traveling over international borders. That's what happened to him when he landed in Moscow and was told that he was not able to leave to another country, and they then bullied the Cubans into rescinding the offer of safe passage so that he could no longer go through Havana. And so what really has happened is the US government first forced him to stay in a place that he never wanted to be, which is Russia, and then had their loyalists and apologists in the media use the fact that he was in Russia as evidence that he was a Russian spy. And there's all sorts of other evidence that make clear how absurd this accusation is, including the fact that had Edward Snowden wanted to engage in any kind of malicious or self-aggrandizing acts, given the archive that he had a whole variety of options available to him. He could have sold this material for tens of millions of dollars to multiple intelligence agencies around the world and been rich for the rest of his life. Or he could have covertly passed it to American adversaries, none of which he did. He instead did exactly what you want a whistleblower to do, which is to come to journalists at well-regarded media institutions and ask us to go through the material very carefully and vet it and publish that which is necessary to enable his fellow citizens, which he considers to be not only Americans, but all human beings on the planet, to learn about what is being done to their privacy. This is so plainly a pure act of conscience. Somebody who decided that their political principles were serious enough to them that they were willing to sacrifice their own interest and unravel their life in defense and in pursuit of them. And ultimately what I really came to understand about what Edward Snowden did is that the reason why he was willing to engage in this act of conscience was because he did not want to live the rest of his life knowing that he had confronted this extraordinary injustice, which is that there had been this mass, suspicionless system of surveillance that had been constructed entirely in the dark, and that he would know that he had the opportunity to do something about it, but simply acquiesced to it and did nothing. He told me that the pain of knowing that, of having that sit on his conscience for the rest of his life, was so great that there was nothing the United States government could do to him, including putting him into prison for the rest of his life, that would be worse than that. That is an act, whatever else you think of him in the Revelations, that is a pure act of conscience. And yet there has been this extraordinary effort to find the nefarious hidden motive that truly caused him to do what he did. Hence the speculation that he must be a Chinese spy or a Russian spy, or all the other things that have been said about him. And the reason I think this is so significant is because this effort on the part of media and political elites to insist that there must be some nefarious hidden motive that drove Edward Snowden to do what he did, that it can't really be an act of conscience or something that came from true political conviction, it says a great deal. But it says a great deal about the people who make the accusations, but it says almost nothing about him. And what it says about the people who are making these accusations, America's political and media elites, is that they don't believe that he could possibly have acted out of real political conviction or been willing to engage in self-sacrificing behavior in pursuit of political values or the rights of other people, because they themselves have no political convictions. And they themselves would never sacrifice for anyone else. And so they assume that the same affliction of soullessness and cowardice and just being completely free of concern for other people afflicts everybody else in the way that it plagues them. And that's the reason why there's such cynicism over what his motives are, and what leads so many people to say all sorts of accusatory things that are just so plainly contradicted by the evidence. Now, there's another myth that I think is really worth exploring in terms of why not just that it's false, but also what it reveals about our political culture. And this is the myth that says the following, and I'm sure you've heard this one many, many times too. It says, Edward Snowden did what he did because he is a fame-seeking narcissist. He suffers from narcissism. And this is the reason why he decided to disclose these materials. And the thing that amazed me about going back and looking at how this accusation emerged was I realized when I looked at the columns that were being written and the claims that were being made on television in 2013, it was amazing how quickly this script emerged and how coordinated it was. You can pretty much find dozens of these pundits who were saying exactly the same thing, using that exact phrase over and over and over again, to the point that if you were to say to me a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago what a lot of people believe, which is, I think that media outlets and the people who work in them get coordinated messaging. They're all kind of told what to say, they all kind of coordinate what it is that they're going to say. I was very skeptical of that claim. I would have said, no, I don't think there's actually overt or active coordination. You don't actually need to do that. They're really, all it is that they're just like herd animals. You know, they just kind of repeat what others are saying that they see, and there's no need for active coordination. But the extent to which this very specific idiosyncratic phrase, fame-seeking narcissist, came through all of their mouths in such an immediate, quick period of time, almost led me to start entertaining that theory. And what was so striking about it was that it was literally within 48 hours after we unveiled him. We unveiled him on June 10th as the source for these materials, and you can go and Google it, and you will find that by June 12th, this wide array of people, like David Brooks of the New York Times, and Bob Schaefer, the host of Face the Nation, and Richard Cohen, the columnist at The Washington Post, and Jeffrey Toobin, the CNN legal analyst, they all just attach themselves to this phrase, and they all apparently decided that they were capable of diagnosing him, like clinically, psychologically diagnosing this person that they had never heard of before and never met and knew nothing about as suffering from narcissism. Now, just like the idea that he's a Russian spy, there's so much evidence that makes this accusation entirely self-evidently absurd. The very first conversation that I ever had with Edward Snowden was over the internet in encrypted channels before I knew anything about him. The very first conversation I had with him, he said to me, I am absolutely determined, to the point where I don't even want to debate it or talk about it with you. I am completely resolved that I am going to come forward and publicly identify myself as the source for these disclosures. and I'm going to do that very early on in the story. And the reason he said he was so intent on doing that was twofold. One was, he said, I believe that I have an obligation, if I'm going to do something that has this much of an effect on the world, to come forward and account for why it is that I did what I did, to offer an explanation to the people who have been affected. And then secondly, he said, I'm intent on doing it because I don't believe I'm doing anything wrong. Quite the contrary, I believe that what I'm doing is the right thing to do, that it's morally compelled of me, in fact. And so I'm not going to lurk in the shadows and hide as though I've done something shameful. I'm going to step forward and say, yes, I did it, here's who I am, here's where I am, and here's why I did it. But, he told me, the minute that I do that, the minute that I come forward and make my public accounting about who I am and why I did what I did, I'm going to disappear completely from the media spotlight. I'm not going to give interviews, I'm not going to talk to media people, I'm not going to be in public at all. And the reason for that was he knew that the media was going to try and personalize the story about him, which would distract attention away from where he wanted the attention to be, which was not on him, but on the substance of what the NSA was doing, on the substance of the revelations. And so, after we revealed him on June 10th, literally for like the next 4 or 5 months, the biggest TV stars in the United States, you know, like all those actors who played the role of journalist on TV, were calling me almost on a daily basis, pleading with me to arrange for a primetime television interview with Edward Snowden. He could have been on primetime television every single night for months. He could have been easily the most famous person in the world. And yet not only didn't he want any of that, he stayed away from television and all other journalists completely for a year until he finally gave an interview to NBC 3 weeks ago in Moscow. Very strange behavior for a fame-seeking narcissist, I think. I mean, the fame-seeking narcissists that I have known in my life have not stayed away from the spotlight obsessively and compulsively. It just seems a little contradictory. But there's something much more significant about the accusation besides the fact that it's just so plainly false, which is that it's indicative of how whistleblowers in general are treated, and not just whistleblowers, but people who dissent, meaningfully dissent, in any way. And by meaningfully dissent, I don't mean like MSNBC kind of dissent. Like, I kind of think that other party's not really that great, you should vote for them, you should vote for the other party instead. That's permissible dissent. I'm talking about meaningful dissent. People who decide that the prevailing order is so fundamentally unjust that they're willing to go so far as even to break the law in order to resist and confront it. People who are whistleblowers or meaningful dissenters are always subjected to the same treatment, which is they get depicted as suffering from some kind of a psychological disorder. I mean, we were always taught when we were in elementary school and growing up in the United States that people who were dissidents in Russia were sent to mental institutions in Siberia, and to this day, China takes its dissidents and puts them in mental institutions as well because it equates dissidents with mental illness. And if you go back and look at how whistleblowers and dissidents in the United States are treated, it really isn't all that dissimilar to the way that Edward Snowden was maligned as suffering from the psychological affliction. When I was growing up, one of my primary childhood hero was Daniel Ellsberg. I admire Daniel Ellsberg for all of the obvious reasons that most people today admire him, although in 1971 when he did what he did, very few people actually admired him. And although I always admired Daniel Ellsberg, there was always something I found really confounding about the Pentagon Papers leak that he did, which is the response by the Nixon administration to learning that Daniel Ellsberg was leaking the Pentagon Papers was to break into the office of his psychoanalyst to try and learn about his psychosexual secrets. And the reason this always mystified me was because it seemed like the ultimate non sequitur, right? Like, the headlines were, Pentagon Papers, major leak, reveals that the US government has been systematically lying to the American people for a decade about the Vietnam War. And then the response of the Nixon administration was going to be, Daniel Ellsberg is a swinger and has this unnatural attachment to his sister from the age of 7 that he's working out in therapy. Why would they possibly think that would be effective? Like, I could never quite figure that out.